Hello. Today, I want to welcome you to our group Veterans in Conversation, brought to you by The Power of Our Story and facilitated by Barry Zworestine, combat medic from the Rhodesian Bush War and currently a psychologist in Australia, and retired United States Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Scott Duncan. My name is Sarah Carell, founder of The Power of Our Story, and we are a community where veterans, first responders, and all protectors can connect, share their experiences, and heal together. So, with that, I will hand it over to you, Scott.
Well, thank you as always, Sarah. We absolutely appreciate that. Well, welcome aboard, everybody. Today is a beautiful Friday here in San Diego. I'm sure it's probably nice where you are as well. If not, you should come check out San Diego, right? But anyhow, today on Veterans in Conversation, we have a gentleman named Robert Kilsby who we'll be talking with today. So we're very excited to get into his story. But before we do that, I want to do two things. First, uh, you'll see that Robert served in the Vietnam War. And here in the States, when you meet somebody who served in the Vietnam War, a good thing to do is to tell them, welcome back, welcome home. And so, Robert, I want to start by saying, welcome home to you, brother. Right. Amen. Okay. So now I have the honor here to read a bio for Robert. So I'm gonna start out with doing that, and then we're gonna hand it over to Barry, and Barry's gonna lead us through. Barry is in Australia with Robert, so there's a kinsmanship there, and we're gonna see where things go from that. So I'm gonna switch up my screen here so I can get to the bio. Okay, here we go. So let's strap in here. So today, we're honored to welcome an extraordinary and Tier 1 veteran from the Vietnam era, Robert Kilsby. Born on Boxing Day in 1951 in the small coal mining town of Leigh Creek, South Australia, Robert's early years were steeped in the spirit of adventure, bushland escapades, go-kart races, and the kind of rugged independence that would come to define his life. By age 14, Robert had already experienced one of life's hardest lessons, his parents' separation. But instead of falling, he rose. He understood something rare at that age, that people, even parents, are human. That insight marked the beginning of a lifelong journey of resilience, purpose, and service. In 1969, just one day after Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, Robert began his military career. He joined the Australian Regular Army with a determination to be part of the Vietnam War before it ended. Not long after, at just 18 and a half years old, he became one of the youngest soldiers to be badged as an SAS trooper, an elite path marked by grit, humor, and unstoppable drive. From high risk operations, including those with SEAL Team 1 in Vietnam, to developing unconventional warfare tactics back home, Robert helped shape the future of Australia's special forces. His career spanned infantry intelligence, Mandarin Chinese language training, and leadership roles in SASR counterterrorism operations. But even more than his service record, Robert is known for his Larrikin spirit, humility, and deep commitment to his mates. And for those of us that aren't Australian, I looked this up because I hadn't seen the word larrikin before. And it essentially means a maverick spirit, someone who's unconventional. So just wanted to get that out there for you guys. His post military life has been just as extraordinary, from founding Veterans in Motorsport Australia to paddling 2,450 kilometers down the Murray River at age 70 to raise funds for homeless veterans. Robert has never stopped showing up for his country, his tribe, and his cause. Even after facing down stage 4 cancer and open heart surgery in 2024, Robert's next mission is already underway, becoming a keynote speaker and author. His message: Ultimate Freedom: How to Be in Charge of Yourself, a philosophy forged in fire, lived on two battlefields, one in combat, the other in life. You're about to hear from a man who's never stopped pushing limits, who embodies courage, service, and reinvention. So, again, welcome aboard, Robert. We're glad to have you.
Yeah. Now I'm blushing, right?
We've only just started, Robert, so fasten your seatbelt, my friend. Yeah, thanks, Scott. And just before we kick off with how the conversation works, I just want to say, we have these stereotypical ideas of what it looks like in your 70s. And of course, there's only about, I don't know, a couple of years between Robert and I. And what I loved about him from the minute we started talking on the phone was just his constant passion for renewal, for service, for writing a book. He's constantly got projects in mind, and he really redefines that age is about chronology. It's really not about the strength of your spirit and the will to be of service. So, Robert, just from that alone, you lead the way in really creating hope for anybody in any situation. So I want to thank you for that. Um,
Yes.
what we generally, this conversation works on post service, but also incorporates the lessons and the wisdom from service and how that applies to creating an effective transition. We acknowledge that there are so many veterans, and I also include first responders, in incredible levels of isolation and aloneness, and that a lot of our suicide rate is simply because people get lost on the way, they lose hope, and they lose connection. This podcast, I think, is important because it offers living examples of people that have gained wisdom and also demonstrate that wisdom in their lives. We have a diagram that Scott, with his superb artwork, and me throwing in a couple of ideas, put together. I don't know if we can bring it up, Scott, or I can just read from my.
I'll grab that while you're
Yeah,
talking here. Give me one
yeah.
sec.
And that kind of looks at the things we generally cover, but we also acknowledge that there will be many things outside of this. So it's always good to enrich it and expand on it. The Marines never arrive on time, eh?
Yeah, I had to admit this. I gotta put my glasses on.
That's okay. I can start just working on the three basic points in the triangle.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
what we worked out was that there are essentially three core components that provide a container to the transitioning service, to the transitioning process. The first one is wellness, because so often as people transition, they let go of their wellness and there's a deterioration in well-being and fitness, eating, and as a result, all the things associated with that, like alcohol. And the one thing that we can get to, we acknowledge that trauma is complex and the transitioning process is complex, but we still are empowered to impact on our well-being. And I liken those to that whole concept of the pull through. All of us can pull through our weapons and clean, both oiling the external parts and putting the oily rag through the barrel, which really is about looking after your physical well-being and your internal well-being, regardless of the storms that we are walking through. The second one is also tribe. And more I understand that the dislocation and connection from others is a part of why so many people struggle and suffer. And as Sarah pointed out, the tribe of the power of our story is a place where people belong. And I've found in my work with veterans over the years that as soon as we start to impact on our wellness and as we relocate into tribe, only then do I tend to look at what's left. So often the impacts of what we perceive to be post-traumatic stress or just trauma, combat stress or transitional stress, a lot can be resolved just on the fundamental baselines of working on those two. And finally, at the top of the triangle is the concept of faith. Now, faith is different for every single person, but faith is just a belief. Here we go. So faith is just a belief in something which transcends the earthly challenges. It's I suppose, in terms of your selection, Robert, it's what is it that kept you going when all else was falling out? It's that absolute belief in yourself and whatever else it may be. In my time of working with veterans, these are the things I identified it, but I also acknowledge that there are many other possibilities, which is loss of tribe, loss of belonging, loss of purpose. PTS, as I keep saying, veterans are not disordered. And as much as I create a little bit of heat around many professionals, we are not disordered. And so I don't like the term. Their moral injuries, grief, which I find is probably at the baseline of most people's experiences when we strip away the story, imposter syndrome. And that might be an interesting one to touch on. I don't know if that ever came with you, Robert, but I found that so many people I work with, including myself, struggle with that one. Then there's the transitional experiences, operational impacts, impacts on relationships, and merging the soldier into the civilian, not leaving the soldier behind. So that's the kind of the map that forms aspects of the conversation. But what we'd like to maybe start off is just a little bit about your journey and how have you transitioned forward? What have you learned? And what's the wisdom you can begin to offer and the stories that help you understand that? And then we'll just let the conversation happen organically.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Cool. Your turn, Robert.
Oh, my turn. Yeah, I was just mesmerized.
Yeah, yeah, people get that way.
No, that's a good triangle you got up there. I just took a screenshot of it
I'll
because
send it to you. I'll send it to you as well.
yeah, do that. That's a good one. And you know, it's the thing about it is I think from all of us, and I certainly include first responders here. My son was a very good infantry soldier. Did a number of tours with places like Timor and Solomons and things like that. And he got sick there. Otherwise, he would have been heading for the SAS regiment too. He was a very good soldier, like a lot of his mates from one battalion did. But he was had to be medevaced out of the army because of his illness, which was quite severe. There's a lot of gremlins up there in Timor. And then he joined the Victorian Police Force and spent about 8 or 9 years in the Victorian Police Force. And finally, he was a go-to man in there. I remember him telling me about, he'd speak to his mother and wouldn't tell her anything about the things he's been up to. He'd just talk son to mother. But and I'd always say, well, what have you been doing? In operations. And he'd say, oh, well, the other day I was able to pull a guy. I arrested a guy. I had to chase him across 6 roofs in the middle of Melbourne in the bad area. Well done, well done. So in the end, he left the police force due to actually PTS himself. Because domestic violence is one of those things in particular that besets police forces, and I'm sure it does in the States. And cutting bodies off verandas and things like that. It's pretty hard yards for the law enforcement people, in the field at least anyway. So I'm aware of that side of it, and also the other thing I'd say in balance with first responders is that military as opposed to first responders. First responders have got a career generally if they're field troops. They're out there every day, and they and it goes on for years. Whereas military have their excitement times, which is generally a lot less than waiting around for the next war, so to speak. So all power to the law enforcement guys, including yourself, Rich. Yeah. The thing is, I think. The transition, though, is different. What I was trying to sort of start with was the transition from the military to civilian life is different for just about everybody, even though there's many similarities between it. And that's why I like that triangle, there with the various components in it, because you might get someone who only sort of clicks on maybe two or three of those things around, and others have a lot more. So um, it's an interesting thing. In my case, um, I wasn't diagnosed. I'm a latecomer to PDS diagnosis, right? Um, and in fact, part of the reason was um, that I didn't want to go through the process because I felt that a lot of people were rorting the system, and I wasn't going to be part of that deal. Um, and it's not so bad nowadays. They've sort of done a lot of adjustments and so on, but like any system that gives a lot of welfare and things like that, you often find some people actually twisting and rorting it. And I'm a bit allergic to that sort of deal. I've got my core values, and that's not one of them. Um, the other thing is that I'd say is that one of the big problems, well, I wouldn't say problem. Let's say one of the situational aspects is that some people prepare better than others to leave. Um, the loss of tribe is a big one, I think, for a lot of people because they're not prepared for it in a sense. That's been my observation. They all all is good, and then suddenly all is not good, and they they it's a bit of a shock, to them. Um, so it's just a very interesting thing, not only from the psychological point of view, but just from the situational point of view, seeing different people go through different things. In my case, I would say that I was quite prepared. The transition was my plan, and like when I was a kid, I used to plan these things, and so I was quite ready for it. I still had the the same bark ripped off me when I got into the dog eat dog world of the civilian life in the second battlefield, as I call it. But I was able to handle that pretty well generally. I'll leap ahead a little bit here. So right in the 2000s, so I left the military officially in about 1990. I came back and did a bit of reserve work to help the army raise a psychological operations sort of capability and concept. Um, but officially I left at the end of 1990, and so I had a long, I've had a long second battlefield, you know, um, and but when I left, I left because I wanted to leave, and it was part of my plan. Whereas a lot of guys have a lot more problems than that. Face the dislocation of expectations, if nothing else, and certainly they have a fear. They have a grief, as is up on that triangle, where the loss of tribe. They're not in the bosom of the buddies. It's interesting after Vietnam. Um, uh, some people got out of the military. They not only went out of the military in normal circumstances, but they left after being in a war. Uh, and I've met many Americans who've been in that boat. When the war finished, then they went back to being a mechanic or helping dad in the law firm or whatever it was. So that's like a double shock. Because there's nothing like being in a war zone and being in the point of it. Um, and then suddenly you're back where people don't even, I these days in Australia, I think that if I talk about Vietnam at all, which I don't very often, to certainly to people who haven't been there, in the war, I find that most people have trouble even spelling Vietnam these days. It's sort of like ancient history. Where Vietnam? Where's that? What was that? It's a long time ago, right? Um, I'm still a sort of a mature age teenager, really. Um, that's how I sort of class myself. Um,
Rob, I'm going to jump in because you're dropping some really great bombs of wisdom
yeah,
that
yeah. Sorry,
I
mate.
want to just
Yeah,
catch. No, 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 nothing to put. But boy,
Yeah,
you're throwing some things which are extraordinary, and I want to catch up on those.
yeah, yeah.
So, for
Yeah,
example,
please direct me. Yeah.
you talked about moving from one operational zone to another, and I think that's a really interesting concept in terms of transitioning from the military into civilian life. You also talked about all the stresses and the creaks and the groans. And what I'm wondering about is in your own existence and from your time in service, what were, because, as we both know, Vietnam and Rhodesia were periods of history where there was nothing known about PTSD or
Mm.
PTS or anything.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so they probably didn't even exist in our minds because they didn't exist around us.
Mm.
So you had to find your wisdom the hard way. It wasn't in books, it wasn't in tribes, it wasn't
No,
in
no.
everything that was being written and the research around it. What did you learn from your time in service? What were the experiences in your service that taught you the tools that you take to your present, which is certainly um, an example of how one can keep the fire alive and progress forward extremely effectively?
Yeah, well, I'll just jump forward and when I finally, and I did this for my wife really, having PDS, I didn't care about myself, right? So I didn't do it for myself, but I finally went through the process. Initially, I did it wrongly. Um, I would put it around, I reverse engineered it somehow, and I put it around back to front, and that didn't work with the powers to be. But I did it for my wife to give her some security, and find she's been such a tremendous person and backed me all the time. Um, and it was interesting. I'm just jumping around here, but it'll hopefully it will come out in the end. But we had one of the psychiatrists that I eventually went and saw. He said, "Oh, it'd be good to meet your wife as well." And I said, okay. So I came down and he asked her, he said, oh, was he, Robert had a problem with this or, she just looked at him in a little bit of amazement and she said, well, no, he hasn't changed at all. He's been always been like this. So, so I I always thought that was quite humorous, really. But because a lot of problems with veterans and first responders is the proximity aspect, of visiting it on their families, and that leverages that into even more pressure.
How
Uh,
were you when you came back, Robert? When
well,
you
I was ready for the next war. When I left the SEAL compound, I remember this. When we left the SEAL compound in Dongtam, as we got on the old what they call the six by, where and we trundled out of and one of the boys in the November platoon yelled out. I heard him yell out of the compound, "See you next war, man!" So and that's like the professional attitude about soldiering.
so how
So
did you, because that's the one that keeps everybody almost institutionalized into military institutions. And Scott, kind of jump in as well, please.
yeah, yeah,
So how did you manage to get out of that and to embrace civilian life? So you were clearly ready and you had a plan. So what did
yeah.
you do that was different and how did you get to that?
Well, I'm a sort of I love operations, right? In fact, when my son went to Timor the first time, he's just sent a postcard back, and he's a bit like me. He sent a postcard back, and on it, he only wrote a few words. He said, "Dad, I love operations." And I thought, yes, yes, you know, chip off the old block or something. But when uh, I left the military, I'd already planned for the next operation. In civilian life. I had another mission, and and I am that like that to this day. I've got to have a mission. I've got to have something to get my teeth into. I've got to have something that's, and certainly in the later years, I need meaningful things to do, and that's where the veteran cause is so beaut for me, is because that's quite meaningful. Helping others, and trying to help, impart some of your experience to help them out on their journey as well. So that's a very strong sort of ethos for living longer, in my view, you know. And if it wasn't what I was doing now, I'd have already planned two other missions to do as soon as I'm finished these ones. Um, so when I left Vietnam, I was still in the regiment for quite a while, and you know, you're too busy with training and getting ready for the next war, so to speak. And so that is tremendous. When I was eventually properly diagnosed, um, I went to a lady who was just about retiring. She was actually on the couch. I was sitting up. You know, she was had a fair number of ailments, and but she'd done a lot of work with Vietnam veterans, and which is one of the reasons I went to her. And we had about 6 or 7 sessions only, and she built this great big file. You know, I said, well, and it was interesting because I hadn't done this time. I left my ego at the door and my salesmanship at the door, and I just answered her questions you know, with the truth. You know, instead of making sure she knew I was the most positive person she'd ever met, you know, sort of thing. Um, I wasn't in denial. I understood it, but you know, I sort of moved on already, in a sense, in my own mind. But but anyway, at the end of the 6 sessions, each of which I had to drive home, and I nearly killed myself a few times on the road home because I wasn't concentrating. It was getting to me, these sessions. And in the end, I said, "Well, where do we go from here?" And I noticed you got this file. It was about an inch or two, inch and a half thick or something. And I said, "Well, what's all in there?" And she said, "Well, it's all about you, Jack," you know, sort of thing. And I said, "Well, you know, gee, you know, that's a lot for just a few sessions." And she said, and then she gave me the diagnosis, and she said, "You know, I've got to tell you this. You've got one of the worst PTSD cases that I've seen in a Vietnam veteran." I said, "No, no, that's not me. That can't be right. You know, I'm feeling pretty good here, you know." And she said, "Well, actually, that's the case." And she said, "But on the other hand, you've got the very best coping mechanisms I've ever seen. And I want you to actually come back. I'd like you to be able to come back. I'll get some other psychiatrists around me, some of my colleagues, and I want you to tell them how you do that stuff." And I thought, nah, that's a bridge too far. One's enough, you know, not six in a room, trick cyclist, you know. So, but it was interesting to me because what it showed to me was that I did have good coping mechanisms, and but I didn't deny it. I just didn't take any heed of it, in a sense. You know, I think, well, I can't afford to waste my life sitting around the corner in a fetal position, saying I've got this and I've got that. And, you know, it doesn't define me. I define myself. So you want to be fast to catch up with me. You know, as I've said a couple of times to, and people have written in books and things that, you know, I've been chased by the black dog a few times and I've knocked him over most times, you know. And so I've got very good coping mechanisms. But I think the main thing is you know, no doubt you've done your time in helicopters, but I call it the helicopter view of life. You know, if you get up at altitude, you can see a long way, right? So I call that vision. I call it the helicopter attitude, vision. And so I'm already planning ahead all the time. So it gives me something to do. Whereas a lot of guys who don't plan ahead, they're sort of like down the bottom of the barrel, looking up on steep walls and from the dark and thinking, how the hell do I get out of this? You know, I've been in a couple of situations through my life as I've investigated all this stuff, and sort of the analogy to me is I got the hands on the top of the toilet bowl and my feet are in the water. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I hope no one's going to push the plunger on me.
So
But I've
what were the
managed to crawl
tools,
out each way. You know.
Robert? I mean, how, you know, a lot of people don't have the gift of this incredible level of resilience that you do have. What would you offer the younger generation who's stuck in a cold, dark place
Mm.
and don't have that ability to sort of almost operate effectively into change. They don't know how to get that helicopter view. What taught you? What are your tools?
Well, I've sort of I've I'm a student of life, I guess, and I go with the Zen saying, be a sponge, not a rock. It's hard to get through a lot of troubles by yourself, and humans are herd people. We need our friends, our family, our proximity around us, and that's like armor in a sense. It's at least armor where you can get through the hard times. Uh, but when you're by yourself in your dark room alone, life looks pretty desolate.
So that's the concept of tribe and connection.
Yeah,
Scott, I know you're
absolutely.
popping. Is your mic is it joined or
No, no, I'm probably fiddling with a chord where I
no,
shouldn't.
no, no. Scott's mic's gone AWOL a
Oh,
bit.
okay.
While he's fixing that up, I'll just carry on.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
your level of resilience and your capacity to almost disconnect from the challenges on the ground are quite remarkable. Did you know that you had, do you think that you had severe PTS?
No, I didn't think that. In fact, um, some people around me said, "Oh, you should go and see someone." You know, as it often happens, I think. Um,
Yeah.
because I was too busy. I was too busy with the mission and getting on with it, and so I knew that things weren't normal. But one of my best friends in the regiment, very very great soldier, he used to say, the thing about we in the special air service, we're all different, And I said, yeah, well, I'm different because I'm normal.
Yeah. Hold that
Everyone's
thought,
got a
Robert.
point of difference. So that it's harder in a sense in a group like that where it's very you're dealing with a very small percentage of the population
Mm.
who've been selected for the very small percentage of personality traits
Well, the
to be able
thing
to
is,
do
as
that
you
job.
say, you're at a tier one level, you're dealing with a different, almost species of human being. And I think how one translates those skill sets that are wired in or inherent to, your SAS SEAL team boys, what is the wisdom of that people can learn from and use as they adjust? Now, I guess the question is, what made you think that you had PTS is the first thing. What symptomatology, were you showing?
Well, I think primarily was the voices of other people looking at me and saying, you know, this and that, maybe you should talk to someone or, I was too busy, I was too focused on mission and all of those sort of things. I was completely focused. If you like, indirectly, I knew that if I wasn't like that, I felt tortured.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
felt
yeah.
I didn't feel good, right? So I needed that mission. And when I was in a mission, that was panacea to me. That was excellent. And I had things to get my teeth into. And I still feel sort of like that today. I'm not much good at sitting around watching the paint dry. And that's why I'm a bit allergic to retirement in a sense, or the concept of it, because I find that a lot of people who do that, watching the paint dry, they die early. You know, they're not activating their
Yeah.
life. And
And I think that's a really valuable point because I think you've identified a really cool thing that when we stop having a mission, and often I think post-military, it generally looks at a mission of service. Sure, there's belonging to
yeah,
tribe,
yeah,
there's having a job, keeping fit, but that mission of service is
yeah,
is critical. So that was certainly something. I think the danger also, as you pointed out, which is an important lesson, is that we can't run away from what we carry.
no,
in my
yeah,
case, I was an ultra marathon runner and I was trying to run away from what I was carrying. And I always say the wolves of what we carry always run behind us 100 meters behind us, and at some point we're going to have to stop. Then they circle us and they look at us, and at that point we become accountable for what we're trying to run away from. Did you have that moment where you realized that you couldn't run anymore, and yes, that you had a mission, but did stuff ever start to creep up around the edges of yourself?
Well, I think the aspect with me was that one of the problems I had was, the general talk and certainly it's a psychiatrist and psychological, psychologist sort of question is, well, thing, what was the thing that tipped you? What was the event? What was the trauma? What was what episode? And I'm thinking to myself, well, I can't have PTSD because I didn't have any episodes. I didn't anything like that. Nothing moved me sufficiently to get in the headlines, and say, well, this is what happened, And a lot of people look back and, I think they've been coached a little bit by the psychology sort of fraternity to be looking for that, wow. And there it was, one day I was walking along and then all of a sudden, the car crashed in front of me. And ever since then, I've been like this, that sort of a story.
Yeah,
And I was
yeah,
never like that. And so it took me quite a while to understand that I hadn't had one episode. I had hundreds, I had, and I just got back up and pulled the boots on and away I went, each time. And I thought that was normal. I thought it was just doing my job and that's it, So I didn't have but, now, when I'm looking into it a lot more deeply, I look back and I can pick out many of these, I flippantly say, I've dodged death many times, but in fact, I shouldn't be flippant about it because I have, but,
yeah.
to me, it's just normal. Um, but to other people, they go, whoa, gee, how'd you put up with that? How'd you manage to get through that? Because I get through that like I get through every other one. Um, but now each of them is a story in itself, right? To the
Yeah,
average listener.
yeah.
But in my case, it was just like more of the same.
So in many
And
ways,
I
as you
got used to
say,
that idea.
so it's almost like the little pinpricks that each one in itself is not profound, but when you add
Yeah,
them
but
up
they
all
accumulate.
together.
Yeah.
But the
Mm.
other thing I often have and then I know, Scott, is your mic sorted?
I think it is.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, there
that
we go.
great voice. There he is. So I think the other thing is also that I wonder sometimes, I called it post-transitioning military challenges. And I wondered sometimes whether the symptoms of transitioning can replicate what can be too easily diagnosed as PTS. So let's say you've transitioned,
Mm.
you're stuck in a unit, you've lost tribe, you're depressed, you're eating badly, your mood's going down, you become anxious because your money's running low. So now you become more depressed, you don't feel like you're living. You bring those symptomatologies to a professional, they find out about your background and
And,
diagnose.
and if I can just jump in there,
Yeah, jump in.
and the
Yeah, and the
family
family. Yep,
leverage there too, with
yep,
so not only do they lose their job or they, lose money or their health or all
yep,
that sort of thing, but their family reacts to this. It was been reacting to this as well, and sometimes it's too much for them. So they lose their wife or their husband, or they lose their kids, or the kids.
correct.
And that's a huge compounding factor, I think, for a lot of guys, a lot of veterans.
So when we can maybe, with very clear assessment, when we can actually identify that it's maybe not about service, because I don't think there's a direct line between service and PTS for every single human being.
No, no, no.
But when we can identify that the transitioning process may be actually quite complex and that it's not about medication or it's not about a diagnosis, but it's accepting the challenges of a very difficult transition. It's like telling somebody, on the nearly 2,000 kilometers worth of canoeing and you're struggling, you're depressed, you're anxious, you feel hopeless. It's like telling you you've got PTS, but your body's actually reacting normally to to a very challenging situation.
Mm.
Or in my case, I always use the example of around 60 or 70 kilometers on an ultra marathon. You don't want to
Mm.
be there.
Mm.
But it's easy to take symptoms and turn them into a diagnosis. Whereas when we normalize where appropriate, and put it in a framework, maybe people transition more effectively. I don't know what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, well, I think I thought a lot about this in recent years, and I think that it's important to. I mean, my message as a keynote speaker is how to be in charge of yourself. That's the ultimate freedom. And I gotta say that I've been in charge of myself for quite a number of decades, right? So I'm fortunate in that I was able to absorb things and put them into action for that purpose, in a sense, and that gives me, in a sense, a huge advantage over over a person is not in charge of themselves. They're trying to fit in still. They're trying to live. Effectively, they're living other people's lives to some extent. They're trying to fit in. They want to be loved. Like, one of the big fears of not being loved, and they want to be part of the deal. They want to be part of the group. Well, I've never had that. Even as a kid, I was never felt that I needed to be part of a group. As a kid, but I was accepted by each group. Each group, they'd said, "Oh, welcome back. This is good." So I could drift between groups, and I was accepted by every group. But I didn't want to be part of any group because that's too confining, group think and all that. Even as a kid, I was like that. So the other thing is, it's interesting that in recent years, I've come to understand that, one of my superpowers is ADHD. You know what I mean?
You
So,
could have fooled me, Robert.
so, but I've never thought about that. No one's ever told me, but my my psychologist, who I see now and then to give me that framework in which to work, which is, I'm sort of self-actuated, so I get her to make sure I'm just heading down the right path, basically, as in the structure, which helps me. And I check in, and say, yeah, am I still going down the right path? Oh, that's all right. It's like having a personal trainer at a gym. Am I lifting that weight the right way? Is it efficient? Am I wasting my time? That sort of stuff. So that's how I use my psychologist. She's brilliant. She's an ex British Army psychologist, actually, so she understands me pretty well.
Yeah,
Um,
that's great.
yeah,
Robert, I'm
she's
going to
really
hand
good.
over to Scott because
Yeah, yeah,
he's going to grill you now. So
yeah, yeah. No,
you
that's
know,
good.
you know, what you know what Marines are like.
If you don't ask me questions, I'm just going to waffle on, right? So,
No, you never waffle. No, they're jewels of wisdom, my friend. I wouldn't go there. Scott.
Yeah, I would absolutely say jewels of wisdom. Yeah, sorry, I had a mic issue. My mic dropped, and then my speakers weren't
mm.
working either. So I'm not home. I'm in a hotel in San Diego,